with other human beings, and primarily we are created to live in good relationship with God, our Creator. It's perhaps that we most fail to do, because as the Old Testament tells us, all those harmonious relationships were very quickly broken in what we Christians call the fall. And the bulk of the Old Testament from Genesis chapter 3 is really about how those relationships with the earth, with one another, with God, can be restored, recreated. So the Old Testament goes on to tell the story of Noah, who is said to walk with God, that is, to live in harmonious relationship with God. It tells us the story of Abraham, to whom God makes promises, the promises of a land which he and his descendants will inhabit, and promises also that he will have descendants. And so we hear the story then of his son, his descendant Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob's son Joseph, he of amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. Through Joseph, all of Abraham's people, all his descendants, end up in the land of Egypt. And we find them there at the beginning of the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. Here we discover that the people are enslaved, and that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, hates them so much that he orders the killing of any male child as soon as it is born. However, we also hear that one child, Moses, is hidden and discovered by Pharaoh's very own daughter and brought up as her son. However, as an adult, Moses kills another Egyptian and has to flee. But in exile, when he makes a new home, he marries. And one day we find him tending his father-in-law's flock when suddenly he sees a bush on fire. Strangely, this bush does not burn up, and so he turns aside to have a look at it. And then, even more strangely, a voice speaks to him from that bush. And so this is where we'll have our first text, Greg, the first passage I'd like you to look at tonight. And this is what the voice says from the burning bush. The voice is, in fact, the voice of God. You can have a look now at this first extraordinary encounter between Moses and the living God. So if you read here, God tells Moses that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is, the voice speaking from the bush is the God who has been known to Moses' ancestors and whom we encountered in the book of Genesis. God goes on to say that he has seen, intensely seen, the suffering. He has heard the cries and known in the depths of his heart, as it were, the affliction of his people. And God wants to respond to this suffering of his people by delivering them from their suffering. Very nice of God, we may say, but it does raise a sort of deeper question of why God did not respond earlier, as soon as the suffering of the people began. Indeed, that deeper question of why God allows suffering at all. Surprise, surprise, I've not got any huge new original answer to this. I think we could take this up in the discussion later if you wish to do so. What I would ask you to do is just to note that for us, God is always present and we don't always notice him. What's happened in this account is that Moses has suddenly noticed God and listens attentively to what God is saying and then responds to God. God is calling him to act for him. As we saw last week, human beings are created to represent God, to act for God. And so God knows of the people suffering, and he calls human beings, in this case Moses, to aid people who are in suffering and to relieve them of their suffering. Anyway, as I said, that's possibly a whole issue we'd like to return to later on. So anyway, God's come through Moses to deliver his people, and he's going to bring them to a good and broad land, a wide land, flowing with milk and honey, as it says. So this is where he is going to bring his people to. A destination is this promised land, the land promised to Moses' ancestor, to Abraham. And God goes on to tell Moses that he's sending him to Pharaoh on this mission. As we see then, Moses questions God and says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the people of Israel out of Egypt?" Which is a good question. What distinguishes Moses? Is there some special extraordinary gift he has, like the young child Arthur who could pull a sword from a stone? Or does he have extraordinary superhuman powers like the Marvel superheroes? Perhaps he's stronger than anybody else or swifter than anybody else or can make himself invisible. Well, no, it's nothing like that. He's not superhuman. What Moses has, as God replies, is simply this. What distinguishes Moses is that God is with him. God says, I am with you. What Moses has is a deep relationship. And if he responds with that deep relationship with God and trusts God, then, as we discover, extraordinary things can happen. And God then goes on to say not only that I am with you, but then that he will bring his people out to serve God on this mountain. The mountain is actually called here in Exodus chapter 3, Horeb, but later on it's called Sinai. So this is Mount Sinai. So although God is bringing his people out of Egypt to the promised land, he's also secondarily, perhaps more importantly, bringing them to Sinai to worship him, away from the hard slavery servitude in Egypt into the joyful and liberating service and worship of God on a mountain where spiritually, this is a spiritual destination, if you like, of the people, the right relationships between God and his people will be restored. If you could just go to the next slide, Greg. And Moses then questions God again and says, okay, God, if people ask me about you, what shall I say about you? Not only have you been with us in the past, but what's your name? Names in the ancient Near East, in the Old Testament, are very important. They tell us something about a person. Remember how the name Joshua means the one who delivers, which in Greek is Jesus, or in English, Jesus. So Jesus, we know about him through his name. Jesus is the one who delivers. And so Moses is asking God, what's your name? Who are you? What are you like? Or what can you tell us about yourself? And so God replies, well, his response is rather strange, isn't it? God says, my name is, I am who I am. And I think this could be a fruitful discussion we could have later on. What on earth does God mean by saying, I am who I am? Perhaps it says something about who God is in his being, his very essence, as it were. It says something that he is perhaps eternal. He does not cease to be like everything else, which perishes. God goes on or into eternity. There is an eternity of being expressed by this phrase, I am who I am. If you remember from the previous slide, God also said, I am with you. So God is also perhaps saying here, when he says, I am who I am, that I am always going to be with you. My presence with you is constant and continual, not just with you, Moses, but with all your people, with all people in every moment of their lives, now and in the future, in everything that happens to you. Okay, probably just to move on in a moment, but just to, you're getting ahead of me there, Greg, thank you. Just at the bottom there, just to notice who shall say, I am has sent me, and the Lord, the God of your ancestors has sent me. And notice how I put after the Lord oh, I haven't actually. Is it there somewhere? I can't see because of people. I thought, anyway, never mind that, then I thought it was going to be there. Okay, let's just go on for the moment to the next slide. Moses brings his, sorry, I've just lost where, anyway, what matters here is that Pharaoh does let his people go. He lets them go after 10 plagues, you remember, and eventually Moses does lead them to a mountain. And here at Mount Sinai, we hear of this another encounter, a very long and deep encounter between Moses and God. In fact, so long, it covers half the book of Exodus, all the book of Leviticus, and the beginning of the book of Numbers, a huge section of the Old Testament, indicating the importance of these texts in the Bible. So what happens is that as the people have made their camp, Moses brings them out of the camp to meet God. They take their stand at the foot of the mountain, the lowest part of the mountain. The Lord descends in fire as he was revealed to Moses in fire and comes to the top of the mountain. He calls Moses to the top of the mountain. It's there at the top of the mountain that Moses encounters God. We just go on now, Greg, to the next slide. And then from there, God speaks. And what is going to happen at Sinai is God's going to say an awful lot of things. And he begins by speaking these words: I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery, and you shall have no other gods before me. I hope you recognize this. This is the beginning of what we Christians call the Ten Commandments. Here the 10, later on sometimes called the 10 utterances, the 10 sayings. These are the great guiding principles, the great teachings about how we are to live with God. We are to worship him alone. We are not to blaspheme, and so on. We are to keep the Sabbath day. And our great obligations to other people, to our parents, to our mother and father, to our families, to not kill others, to not steal from others, and not desire what others have, and so on and so on. So these are, if you like, setting out at the beginning of God's words, his teachings. We find these great commands which have come down in Judaism and Christianity, particularly in Christianity, of being of supreme significance in terms of God's teaching. However, as well as later on calling these words the 10 words or the 10 utterances, God also describes the words that he speaks on Sinai as the Torah, which we usually translate as the law or Torah, which I have written for the people's direction. Law is not a particularly good translation of Torah. Torah really means guidance or instruction. It's something to do with the way. Through the Torah, through all these words of God, these teachings, these instructions, these commands, we learn how we are to walk with God, and we learn about the fullness of our relationship with him. So Torah is a word that I may want to come back to later. But secondly, as well as describing what he is doing there as giving his people Torah, God also speaks about giving his people a covenant. A covenant is a word which becomes very important for us in Christianity as well, and something that we could perhaps take up later. It's almost making something like a treaty between two sets of people, in this case between God and his people. It spells out how this covenant spells out how the people are to live with God and to live with one another. And we have heard earlier covenants, firstly with Noah and then Abraham, which I could say more about later. But here the most important thing is to say that as a covenant, this is something which is showing us, telling us how we are to live, to be back in right relationship with the Lord God and with each other and with the world which we inhabit. Okay. After this, after Moses has received the commands and the instructions from God, he returns to camp. But there he discovers that the people have already gone off serving other gods, not serving the Lord alone. They turn from God and they make the idol of the golden calf. And Moses gets angry and God gets angry. But Moses pleads with God to forgive his people. And then this wonderful little passage from Exodus 34, which tells us something more about God, reveals something much more about God, which I just want to share with you now. So the Lord, as it says, takes his stand with Moses on Mount Sinai and proclaims the name. And the Lord, after the Lord there, I've written 4 consonants, Y-H-W-H. And when you see these 4 consonants in Hebrew, you don't pronounce them, you pronounce the word Adonai, which means Lord, which is why we have in our Bibles the translation of the Lord. I can talk about how that has come about later on, but I just wanted to use this. When this is read in Hebrew, you'd be saying Adonai or Lord. So I just want to use Adonai here in this revelation of God on Mount Sinai. So Adonai, the Lord, passes before the face of Moses and calls, Adonai, Adonai. This is what the Lord is like, a God who is tender and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. I've given you a couple of Hebrew words there. Chesed is a very important word in the Old Testament and is usually understood to be the steadfast love of God. And emet is the, and though it doesn't look like it, is a word we get amen from, or is a similar word to amen. And so it's something to do with the steadfastness, the faithfulness, the fidelity of God. So God is here tender and gracious. Tender, I've chosen that translation because this word is connected to the word for a womb. And so the relationship that God has here with his people is almost like the relationship that a mother has with a child in her womb. And God is gracious. God pours out upon his people the wonders of the divine life and invites us to share in that divine life. That's what graciousness, or sharing grace, the grace of God, is all about. So some wonderful ideas of what the Lord our God is like here. The God who is faithful, steadfast, always loving, always there. And that is also, we remember, the God of Jesus Christ, the God of the Father who is revealed to us in Jesus. Okay, let's move on. A huge part of what God has to say to Moses on Sinai concerns the construction of what is usually translated as the tabernacle. In Hebrew, the tabernacle is literally the dwelling place. So all of chapters 25 to 31 of Exodus, 7 chapters, are concerned with the instructions for the tabernacle, the dwelling place. And then the last few chapters, chapters 35 to 46 chapters, cover the construction of the tabernacle. And here's what it says when that tabernacle has been erected at the end of the book of Exodus. So it says to us, Moses has completed the work. A cloud covers the tent of meetings. A cloud covered Sinai when God spoke to Moses. And the glory of the Lord, in Hebrew, the kavod Adonai, a term which is much explained to us when we come to the prophet Ezekiel. We'll have a look at that again. The glory of the Lord, that is the God's marvelous and dynamic and wonderful presence, comes upon the tent and fills the tabernacle, the dwelling place. And it goes on to say that God, the glory of the Lord continues, the presence of the Lord continues to be with his people at every stage of their journeyings. Just a little, I couldn't get away without mentioning Narnia again. Here's a quotation from C.S. Lewis's Stories on Narnia, further up and further in. I'll come back to that in a moment, but just to say, what Exodus is climaxes with is how God comes to dwell with his people, or with all of us, and how we are invited to dwell with him, to share. He shares in our journeyings, and we are to walk always with him. Further up and further in, I'll explain that later on if you want me to, but just to go to the next slide, Greg, to have a look at what I'm calling here the architecture of the Torah. So as well as the instructions and guidance that God gives to his people as Torah, Torah also refers to the first 5 books of the Bible. That's how the Jews know those first 5 books. We call them the pentateuch. Pentateuch is a word which means the 5 scrolls. Remember, in the ancient world, how writing was done on scrolls. So these are the 5 scrolls, the first 5 books of the Bible. They're called the Torah in Hebrew. And I wanted to show you here how, if we go deeper into the Torah, at its heart is the tent of meeting, which is what happens there at Leviticus. The dwelling place is also known as the tent of meeting. So it's at the heart of the Torah. But if we turn this 90 degrees and made it, the tent of meeting was the top, we'd have a mountain. So it's almost so as we go further up the mountain, we encounter God at the tent of meeting, and we also would want to move deeper into the meeting place in Leviticus. Thank you. I think Henry's been showing us the links there. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, because the heart of the Torah, as I've just said, is the book of Leviticus. So Greg, could you just take us to the next slide? Leviticus for Christians is a very difficult book. It seems almost unreadable with its details of sacrificial and dietary and purity laws. But there are great treasures here in the book of Leviticus. First of all, this book is fundamental is a foundational text for the Jewish people, and it centers on the teachings about the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, as it's said now among the Jews. Aaron, it says, shall make atonement. Yom Kippur is about atonement, about being reconciled with God. So there's that wonderful teaching about atonement here in Leviticus. Also, there is half a verse in chapter 19, verse 18. It says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You might have heard that verse before. It's the only time in the Old Testament that this command is given. And Jesus, you remember, says this is half of what is important about the commandments. The greatest commandment is twofold: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. It's only here in Leviticus that we hear that command. And then in chapter 25, there's wonderful teaching about the Jubilee. We probably never read that before, but for those of you who, like me, are quite an age now, remember that in 1994, Pope St. John Paul II sent an apostolic letter out announcing the coming of the third millennium and encouraged us to think about this year of Jubilee and pointed us to explore this 25th chapter of the book of Leviticus, which speaks about how debts are forgiven, slaves and prisoners are to be released, and the land is to lie fallow to allow it to be refreshed. So we are here's a great teaching about how we are to allow the earth, our environment, and every human being to be free and to flourish. So very important teachings here in Leviticus if we take time to tease them out. But let's move on, because we've only got another 5 minutes or so. We move from Leviticus into the book of Numbers and see in the book of Numbers how the people prepare to leave Sinai, how they wander in the desert for 40 years, and how the first generation of people who left Egypt die. And then they come to the east banks of the river Jordan, to the land of Moab. And here beyond the Jordan, Moses reminds them of what has happened to them and how God has delivered his teaching on Mount Sinai. And so the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, reminds the people through Moses is speaking all the book of Deuteronomy. He speaks of God's instructions on Sinai and issues a new commandments as they prepare to enter the promised land. I just want to look at very quickly 2 passages from Deuteronomy. Here in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy is a very important text. Moses says to the people, "This is the command," singular interestingly, "which the Lord your God commanded me to teach you. And this is the great command for the Jewish people. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord one," literally. I'm sure you've heard of that, Shema Yisrael. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is God, is one, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone is God." It's difficult to translate this. We can talk about that later, but here there is that great command. There's almost a second part to this great command, which of course Jesus also takes up. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your being, with all your heart," and heart in Hebrew is just more than lovey-dovey emotions, "with all your breath, with all that gives you vital spirit and energy," which is, of course, we translate as soul, and then "with everything you have got," which is usually translated as might. But I won't deal now with my translations there, but we can come back to talk about that again later. Okay, so Moses speaks to his people about the covenant they made at Sinai, or he made at Sinai with the Lord God. And then at the end of Deuteronomy, he talks about a new covenant in the land of Moab, where they are currently encamped. And Moses says, I'll just read through this, "The word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, for you to enact it. See, I have put before your face today life and what is good, death and what is evil. What I command you is to love the Lord your God, walk in his ways, keep his commands, and then you will live and be numerous." So the Lord puts a choice before us to choose life or death. And we can choose life. We live if we love the Lord God and walk in his ways. Remember, we talked last week about what this walking means. So that is how we find life and what is good. Notice how I've put after life and what is good, inverted commas, prosperity. Often what is good is translated as prosperity. I'm not really sure if that's a terribly good translation, because if we translate it prosperity, what prosperity suggests to me is something like health, wealth, and happiness, and suggests that if we choose God and choose life, or choose faith in God, then we expect to be prosperous in the sense that we can expect health, wealth, and happiness. I don't think we can. That's not what is really intended here. What is intended to say is that what you'll get is what is good. And what is good, as we know from Genesis chapter 1, is to be in right relationship as we were created to be in right relationship, to be in harmonious relationship with the Lord God, with the environment, with the earth, and with all human beings. That is what is good. It doesn't mean we maybe have lots of money or be always well, but it does mean that if we live choose life and live closely by following God's commands and living, walking with Him, then we shall find true happiness, the true happiness of wonderful and rich relationships with the world we inhabit and with the living God. So just a thought there. And then carrying on in chapter 30, it says, okay, if you follow God, that will happen. But if your heart turns away, you do not hear, you do not listen, and you bow down to other gods and serve them, then you will assuredly perish. I wanted to just emphasize that because you can choose life by loving the Lord and listening to Him, as it says at the bottom there. You can choose life by loving the Lord your God, by hearing, listening to His voice and being very intimate with Him. Or alternatively, you can choose death by serving other gods. You can choose life by doing what you were created for, to live with and to walk with God and all of creation, or you can choose other gods, whatever that may mean. And we'll see how the people in the next books of the Bible, so often in their history, do choose to serve other gods. As immediately Aaron and the people of God were choosing to make a golden calf in the wilderness. The people constantly turn away, but God is constantly there, and through the prophets and others, calling people to come back to Him. So we will see in the people's history how they do turn away, but God is always there and saying deep in their hearts and through the prophets, come back to me and love me, love the Lord your God, listen to His voice, cling to Him. This is the way we are to choose life, by doing what we are created for, to walk with Him now and always. Okay. And I think that's just after past, I think. So I hope I haven't rattled through things quite as quickly, but that was just a little bit of reflection on some passages which tell us something about the encounter of Moses, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the chosen people, Jesus's people, of course, and his encounter with the Lord God, the living God, and how it's helped us, I think, perhaps to learn a little bit more about the God who is revealed in the Old Testament and the God whom Jesus speaks to us as His Father. What we're going to do now for the next 10 minutes, as last week, we're going to I'm just going to Greg, could you just go back a few slides, sorry. Just stop. Go forward, next one, and next one. That's it. No, go back. That's it. Thank you. Stay there. I think, I wonder if we're using an old, sorry, Greg, anyway, I'll come back to that later. What we're going to do now is, this is actually at Sinai, not beyond the Jordan. What I'm going to do now is just read slowly through a few of the passages we've looked at tonight, just to end this part of the session by prayerfully reflecting on a few of those passages. So just give you time to think about perhaps what I've said, but more importantly, just to look at the words, to listen to the words, and perhaps a word or a phrase will stand out for you. We'll just do that for the next 10 minutes, just to calm down after, I'm sure, that lot of input that we had there. So, at Sinai, Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they say to me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, "I am has sent me to you." We could just go on to the next slide, Greg. Also at Sinai, the Lord descended in the cloud and he stood with Moses on Mount Sinai. The Lord called out, "The Lord, the Lord, a God tender and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." And now this text, which is indeed beyond the Jordan, on the east bank. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." Let these words, which I am commanding you today, be in your heart. Recite them to your children and speak about them when you sit in your house and when you walk on your way and when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign upon your hand and fix them upon your forehead. Write them upon the doorposts of your house and on your gates. These things bound upon the hand and the forehead and the doorposts are the little boxes which contain key texts from the law, which you'll see Orthodox Jews wearing and also binding on their doorposts or hanging on their doorposts. And finally, since we didn't actually look at any texts from the book of Numbers, just to finish by quietly reading this text, which is actually the back at Sinai. At Sinai, as the people were preparing to depart, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron your brother, and his sons, the priests, saying, Thus you shall bless the people of Israel and you shall say to them this priestly blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face upon you and give you peace. Amen. So perhaps after that final blessing there, what we're going to do in a few minutes is just to go into breakout rooms. I'm sure some of you may not want to do that and want to leave at this point, and I hope you've enjoyed being with us tonight. But before we do go into our breakout rooms, I just want to say one or two things. Firstly, that last text, the priestly blessing, is possibly the most ancient text we possess in the Old Testament. In a discovery of 2 silver amulets in some graves which date from about the 6th century BC, the second amulet seems to contain the lines of that blessing. So that from the 6th century is perhaps the most ancient biblical text we have. That's rather interesting. And just now, Greg, if we just go to look at these questions. So in your breakout rooms, again, like last week, you may like just to reflect on what's brought you back this evening or come this evening to reflect on Moses, the figure of Moses, and that very dramatic and exhilarating encounter he had with the living God. So just you may like to think about that and to share some of your thoughts. Then as you're just listening, as I read slowly through some of the passages, perhaps a particular word or phrase stood out for you. You may just simply like to share that word with the others. And then it may be that you want to say a bit more, what thoughts and questions came into your mind as we explored these passages together. And you may, as it says, like to share your reflections on these questions. So Greg in a moment is going to put us into some breakout rooms, as I say, hopefully a bit larger than some of them last week. Hopefully you'll be in a group of 5 or 6. But before we do that, as I say, I know some people perhaps will want to go now, and thank you for being with us tonight. And I hope you come back next week to find out a bit about what happens to the people after they get into the land, and particularly how about their great king, David. But also, you may not like to go into the breakout rooms. You're very welcome to come back for at 8 o'clock. We will finish the formal part of this meeting at 8. But for those of you who want to stay, I know those who stayed last week enjoyed just discussing or asking questions. And I'll try not to hog everything this week, but hopefully we'll be able to cover quite a lot of interesting material in that half hour. So as I say, Greg will now put us into breakout rooms, and then we'll come back about after 10 minutes.
So just to add to that, if you don't want to join the breakout rooms, you're very welcome to stay just here in the main meeting. If you're having trouble joining a breakout room, then just let me know. Obviously, if you don't want to join the breakout room for the discussion, you can either just remain here in the main part of the meeting until we all come back for the rest of the discussion, or else or just just feel free to leave the meeting now if that's easier.
Are we the only ones that have been good and come back?
Don't worry, everybody's going to be compelled to come back, so you'll be joining us. Here we go. Everybody's.
Oh, mute.
Hopefully Father Tim will be with us.
Hello, I'm here.
Ah, excellent.
Oh, good. We've still got 60 people here, so that's good.
Yeah.
We haven't lost everybody. Or 60 screens. Excellent. Just to say, I hope people have found something of interest tonight. And in our breakout room, there's so much that I didn't explain. I kept saying I'll leave that till the discussion, but we've only got half an hour of that. But I hope that you found something of interest or something which struck you anew. And just by prayerfully looking at the text, perhaps it may be that something has helped you in your faith or understanding of the Old Testament. So I hope it's been of use tonight. And as I say, well, it's 5 to 8, but we'll probably conclude, if you like, for those who wish to go. But for those, and it's been lovely to see you. I do hope you'll return again next week for about King David. But you don't have to go because I think those who stayed last week, I'm sure we all found it very interesting, our discussion next time. Sorry, last week. So you stay and we'll have just half an hour. Well, a bit over half an hour. We'll finish definitely at 8:30. But for those who are going now, lovely to have you.
Thank you, Father. Good night. Night.
Good night to those who are going.
Thank you, Father Tim.
Thank you, Florence.
Thank you.
Thanks, Father. Bye.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye. 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 Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
No, thank you, Tim.
I hope some people will stay. Bye, Dave.
Glanfield in third form 3. Okay. And I remember quite clearly in our book we draw a triangle.
Yeah.
And it was I am who I am, right? Okay, in a triangle. But when you think about that triangle, it's got 3 corners and there's 3 persons in God.
Shall we, if everyone could just go on mute, and I'll just ask Greg again to perhaps try and start us off with some discussion from what's in the chat, or if people want to put their hands up, you're very welcome to do that. And speak as well, because I think last week I tended to be just me with a bit from Alex and Greg.
Yes, so as Father Tim says, do please type some questions in the chat if you have them, or you can raise your hand either on Zoom or just physically. You can raise your hand instead, and I might see you. I can't quite see everybody. There's a couple of screens. So
just before we start, I'm going to say Greg's here. Obviously, lots of difficult philosophical questions around I am who I am, and also the Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord one, what that means. So I'm sure Greg will be able to answer those for us. And then my earlier question about why does God allow suffering? That's one for Greg too. Sorry, Greg. Okay, back to you.
now, so yes, well, I'll give you my 5 new PowerPoint presentations on all those questions. Now, why don't we start off maybe with let's see, David Jackson. Did you have a question? I know, David, you put it in the chat, but you could read out your comment or question maybe. I don't know if we got that, David. Why don't maybe I'll read out this first one just from David. So David was just oh, sorry, no, maybe was that David?
Could everyone just go on mute apart from Greg and me? Yeah, or David.
Okay, I'll read out David's question just to start with. David just asks perhaps for Father Tim, do we take the whole notion of a dialogue between the divine and human for granted?
Yes, probably.
Should we?
Well, I think it's clearly whatever condition we are in, it's clearly very difficult for us to communicate, to dialogue with God. We are aware of over the centuries, in different religions, the techniques that are needed to still your own mind and be able to listen to what God is saying. And so it's probably, I suppose, a spiritual question. And I suppose that's why the Shema is so important. It's saying the most important thing that you need to do to be able to dialogue with me is firstly to make yourself able to listen. And I suppose the great spiritual people are those who are able to do that and to hear God. And wonderfully, we are able in some way, in a limited way, to do it in liturgy, so that we come together, as it were, to also to listen to God and trying to listen to God together, and that's very hard. So I suppose we do take it for granted, but it's incredibly difficult, because but I think what the biblical text is saying is that God is always there, always listening. It's just that we don't pay attention.
Yes, and just a comment from Deacon Joe, just adding perhaps, or in fact, yes, some comments on that from Deacon Joe and Helen Edwards. So Deacon Joe or Helen, do feel free just to maybe jump into briefly add your thoughts before, if you want to, and you can do so out loud, or if everybody else there in the chat before we go on to the next set of questions.
Oh, just to say that the point I've raised is not prayer a form of a dialogue with God? And so is discernment. I mean, both of them are, I would argue, quite challenging things in terms of actually being focused and concentrate. But I would see both prayer and discernment in that quiet moment as actually being a period of dialogue with God. I know this idea of sort of listening to what God is saying is quite hard to actually grasp, really. Well, I find it hard to grasp anyway.
Thanks, Joe.
Helen, did you want to? Yeah, or
yeah, I was just going to say that, about the different levels of dialogue, really, that, individual prayer is like an individual dialogue with God, but I feel that there's like an ongoing dialogue that takes place between God and the church. So, when we look at the early church and the way our kind of key beliefs in the creed came about, that was like a dialogue that was going on as people were sort of trying to express their understanding of God, and it happens now, as we meet new situations, different discoveries, different scientific discoveries, or different moral situations that arise because of just what's going on in life. The church is, we're constantly trying to find new ways of expressing our beliefs and responding to different things that arise, and so I feel that this dialogue almost that began all those years ago still carries on. It's still there now.
There's an interesting comment. Thanks, Helen. There's an interesting comment just from Bob there in the chat to say that in the dialogue with Abraham, it was God who began the dialogue, and so I'm just saying the same was with Moses. God seems to have begun the dialogue there. So it may be that the depth of both Moses and Abraham's relationship with God was so great that they hear God speak to them in every moment of their lives almost, but particularly in such a deep way that they respond. Well, in Moses' case, hears God speaking to him about the suffering of his people and how God is asking him to do something again. As Helen was saying, when we respond together as the church over these sort of things, the church together, we listen to what God is saying, don't we, and respond to that suffering voice that is heard throughout the world, or try to.
If you want to say some,
Yeah.
You're not muted.
Oh, hello. For me, it's the long watches of the night. When Bob's asleep and I've got my Bible open, and I'll be invariably reading either through Psalms or St. John's Gospel. And I think I'm more aware of my spiritual need at those times of day, night, and of being alone with God. Unlike walking down the street or you know, sort of in normal everyday activities as such. That quiet space for me is quite essential to perceiving, not hearing audibly maybe, but perceiving what God's saying to me.
Thank you.
We can have times like that in church as well.
I was just, I thought you might have something to add. I was just wondering, yeah, interesting discussions there about dialogue and listening to God. I was wondering then, sort of from a human side of the dialogue, whether we could move maybe to Michael. Emily, I think, had a question. I don't know if Michael, if you'd like to ask that yourself, or if not, I can read it out. But
okay, I was intrigued by the fact that Moses was going to say a name of God to the people of Israel, because he didn't know the name, and the people of Israel presumably didn't know the name. So it called into question, what was the name of God, the way in which God was referred to beforehand? And I noticed that somebody else picked up on this and said that perhaps an understanding of some of the Hebrew words might be helpful. So I think this is probably for Father Tim and as a Hebrew scholar to perhaps help us understand.
Okay, I'll try as much as I understand it. It's very complicated, of course. And I noticed a question from Simon about a similar sort of question about God's name. We'll come back to the Shema later. There's a question about that too. The word for, clearly in the ancient Near East, there were many gods, as we saw last week in other societies. So these gods have different names, which meant something. So it could be that Moses is simply asking, you know, I know about all these other gods, and the gods of the Egyptians, of course. What's your name then, God? There is a theory that, of course, God has spoken his name earlier in the Bible into Abraham and so on, and it may be that is just retrospectively said to be by the put on to given that name earlier by the biblical authors. But sorry, that's a bit of a sidetrack, isn't it? So maybe that Moses is asking, what is your name? Can you be identified like the other gods of the Egyptians say? However, the God of Abraham and the God who reveals himself now is the God who is known as the Lord. There is the word for God is in Hebrew El. You've probably come across that word before, El, or in its longer form, Elohim. Literally, Elohim means gods, plural, but that is that we use it in the singular, of course, and God would be the one God as revealed to Moses. So the one God has a plural name, as it were, gods, but actually is also known as El, and that may be similar to a Canaanite god known as Il or Ilu, but for the moment it is just the name of, that's one way or one word that is used of God in the Old Testament. And the other one is these four consonants, Y, H, W, H, which we call the tetragrammaton, which means it's Greek for four letters because there are four letters there. You remember in Hebrew how you don't have the consonants, so you don't have the vowels, you only have consonants. So when those consonants appear in the Hebrew text, the people who put in the vowels said that we were to pronounce that name as the name of God as the Lord. So that's why we say Lord. And Jesus, and in the New Testament, they refer to, when that name appears, they refer to the Lord or Adonai. So that's a little bit about the Lord's actual name. But that name, those consonants are probably related to the verb to be, which is, and it may mean something like he who causes to be. It's definitely a third person, he or he who is. And so that is related to I am who I am. That's the first person. There's a similar, there's something in God which is to do with, if you like, with being, about being, about, this is where I get into difficulties and ask for Greg to say something more clearly perhaps about God's nature is to do with God is being per se, as it were, and something to do with God. Our being comes to an end, we perish and die, but God's being does. God is, he is the one who is, or God is, I am who I am, so God doesn't come to an end. That may be partly what God is saying by revealing his name as I am who I am. Very complicated and long answer. But it then takes us on to the problem of the Shema, which Greg may be able to say a bit more about. The problem with the Shema is that literally it says, the Lord our God, the Lord one. We clearly, both Jews and Christians and Muslims, all take this to talk about there is one God, God who is unique and one and eternal and so on. But it could also mean possibly, people think this is what it originally meant, something like the Lord alone is God, or God is God alone. So there are other gods, or there have been other gods, but now there's only God, or it may just be, it's complicated, but we take it to be, I think. Have I completely lost people?
Sorry, could I come back on that? I mean, yes. Arabic and Hebrew are the same language. Allah and Elohim are essentially the same word. And but the Muslims have, the Muslim rosary is reciting the 99 names of God. Yeah. Which is which are his attributes, I suppose, things like loving and forgiving and things like that. I keep on meaning to study it, but I haven't done it yet. But what am I saying? Yeah, I'll leave it.
So sorry, Bob, to interrupt, but so that other text from Exodus would be rather like that, wouldn't it? That when you say the Lord is tender and gracious and has steadfast love. Those would be the attributes of God. And throughout the Old Testament, we see God revealed in that way. There's something rather distinctive, I think, about, or it has come within Judaism and within Christianity too. I am who I am is saying something. Here, God is saying something which is difficult to understand. It does seem very simple. Perhaps it is just very simple. I think what it is saying is just simply that God is constantly, always with his people, whatever circumstances of life that they are in. So it's saying something about God's essence, as it were, God, how we're to experience God or meet with God in relationship with him. And we experience him as being with us all the time, all day long, all through our lives. Yeah. But, okay, do respond. I'm sorry, that was it's partly technical. I've rushed through it and probably not made it as clear as I could have done.
Well, my understanding of I am who I am is simply God saying, I am the ultimate creator. I made everything, nothing made me. In the same way that yes. Each of us can say who our father and mother are.
Yes, and that's a possible interpretation. I mean, it's not, that would actually coincide with quite a lot of modern scholarship. Because the form of the verb is, not so much I am who I am, but the tetragrammaton, Adonai, that form does look to be a causative form. So it probably literally means he who causes to be. So that goes in with your idea, God as being, when God's, I am the creator, I am the one who causes to be.
Helen,
but I think I still prefer, I think the early rabbis would talk about I am who I am, saying something about God's presence, God being present with us now and always. And I think that for me is the way that I would probably prefer to, is primary meaning.
Helen, or I don't know if anybody else wanted to come on this. Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in that question of Moses, asking God, who, when they ask me for a name, who do I say, what is your name? And it reminded me a bit about Adam naming the animals. And is this, was this people wanting to kind of put God in a little box put a label on God and put him in a little box and say this is what God is, and then God's response is, no, you can't do that. Can't put me in a box. I don't have a name in the way that everything else has a name, because I am not created in that way. I am the ground of all being, and that's what this is. You're asking the wrong question.
I think that's right, Helen. That's another very important interpretation of this. And so, in a sense, there is a mystery there in God, isn't there? That you're never going to find out my name, really. But I can reveal myself in certain ways. But there is also that hiddenness, or that I am the ground of being, as you said. Yeah. Mm. Shall we just? It's very complicated, this area, but just moving on to another area, thinking about an awful lot of the Old Testament are these what we call laws, perhaps better to call them, they're sometimes called commandments, injunctions, statutes. It all sounds very legal. I imagine most people find them very difficult to read. How much of those instructions and commandments that God gave us on Mount Sinai do we Christians follow or need to follow? Are they still binding? I'm just asking you a question. Or how do we discern, if only some of them are binding, how do we discern which commandments are binding?
If we took the fourth commandment seriously, we'd all be Seventh-day Adventists and keep try and follow the Jewish laws on the Saturday as much as physically possible.
Yeah, but Jesus gave us the new law of the new covenant, which is loving the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and loving your neighbour as yourself. Just two, not 10. Which simplifies the matter a bit, doesn't it?
It does.
If you, I think sometimes Christians' response to the concern with ecological issues these days might be more than it is at the moment, because there's no direct law about how we treat the resources that he's given us on the earth.
Beyond love your neighbour as yourself.
And with all life, plant and animal, that we're responsible for. So we've kind of forgotten that down the ages, and we need to rekindle a responsible awareness of what God's given us. Not just spiritual things, but material things as well.
Can I come in on this?
Do.
Yes, please, do, Chris.
Well, it's two things, really. You said we had referred to the Lord as Adonai. There was a period when we used those 4 consonants and pronounced them as Yahweh. And that was in the early Jerusalem Bible translations. Now, what happened to that?
It is anathema.
Yes, but why?
Well,
it's an insult to Jews, basically.
Not just that, it is that's a very important reason why we don't. Very, very important why we don't. So it is insulting. So out of respect, we were asked. Pope Benedict sent a letter out, or what it was a letter to the bishops' conferences to. You can Google this. If I Googled it today, I think it was in 2008, something like that, to say that, as you say, out of respect for the Jews, but also our own tradition would say. I mean, the New Testament does not vocalize the divine name in that way. The Old Testament, when the Old Testament speaks of, it talks of Kurios, doesn't it? Jesus talks of Kurios, the Lord. So it's on Jesus's lips. So we would not want, again, through Jesus himself and in the church's tradition down the centuries, we would want to respect what Jesus says, but also out of respect for the Jews, we would want to pronounce the divine name in the way of respect for God, of course, as well, in the way that has been handed down to us.
And my second point was about Jesus simplifying things to love your neighbor and love God and love your neighbor. I did hear once that the Jews referred to their 613 laws as a yoke or a burden. So when Jesus reduces it to 2, what he's actually saying is, my yoke is easy. My yoke is light. I mean, my burden is light. It's just these 2 things that you have to worry about. And you obey those. And that's all you're asked to do.
So is there any, thank you very much, Chris, for those important, is there any, is there any merit in us still looking through, reading these books? Do we get anything from all that stuff on Sinai, all those 613 commandments, as you say?
Yeah.
What about the 10 commandments? Jesus, of course, transforms them, doesn't he, on the Sermon on the Mount? He quotes them quite specifically and says that actually, let's go a little bit further with these. That's one thing, perhaps. So it's not just killing, but it's not getting angry.
They liked things reduced to a soundbite, didn't they? They liked their teachers to summarize, because, like as somebody was saying, it's such a huge amount to take on. So this is what Jesus was very good at doing, wasn't he?
He was.
He reduced it to a soundbite that everybody could remember. Can
Yes,
I also say, I thought there was some problem with the Jews actually saying God's name and talking about God's name. Am I right there?
Yes. Well, again, it's out of respect, isn't it? You don't,
yeah.
This is
almost as though
God's name here. We don't say that as we would perhaps say the name of that other people have for their gods. We treat God's name, because it is something. Names are something in the ancient world to do with the identity. So we can't possess. There's that sort of magical thing of names as well. You can possess people by knowing their names and all that sort of thing. So we don't want any of that. It's gained respect for the.
Timothy, just to explain about them saying God's name, I think you notice in the synoptic gospels that nobody actually says I am anywhere, apart from when Jesus refers to the Moses and the burning bush and God saying I am the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And you can tell that they are actually that you can see the Jews sort of being shocked at him saying the word I am. But Yahweh, which we don't use in Jewish circles anyway, is offensive to Jews, is a vocalization of the words I am. And I think because God calls himself I am, it's not appropriate for anybody else to use anything like I am in their language. Now,
in Hebrew, you don't have the word to be like that. You say I, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, Job of Moses. You don't say I am the God of. You see, you don't have the verb to be in the present tense like that.
Yeah,
you can't always. If you just read a translation, you see you lose basically a lot of what's going on. You just can't reason from what it says in English to what it says in Hebrew. There's no word am in Hebrew.
In the fourth
Can I just say, just on the Hebrew, Chris, sorry. I think Jesus uses I am in a rather explosive way quite often in John's Gospel. The great I am sayings. I'm not a great expert on John's Gospel, so I can't, but that is, I think, one of the things about what Jesus does there. The other thing is just in terms of this tetragrammaton, is not quite the same as I am. So the first letter of the tetragrammaton, Y, is he, and actually I is another letter, another consonant in Hebrew, which is unpronounceable. So it's slightly different.
But I am is very significant in the fourth gospel, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very significant. Yeah.
Is it 4 times Jesus uses it?
I think more. I don't know if anybody's a great scholar of John here, but
I know it's very important in that gospel.
Greg, do you know? I don't know why I think you're an expert on the New Testament. But...
It's over a dozen. I'm trying to remember.
Is it?
I'm pretty sure. Maybe that's wrong. Anyway, yeah.
I'm sure Google it and it'll come up. Can I just say, I mean, I used to teach the Old Testament 20 years ago. I just looked at when Wikipedia was invented. It's 2001 when I stopped teaching. So I thought, why did I never look things up on Wikipedia? I know I'm not supposed to, but I actually looked at the 10 Commandments on Wikipedia. I thought, that is really an excellent article. I mean, of course, some of it may be a bit false news, but I think it's well worth, if you want to know, think about more about the new 10 Commandments, you could do worse than just looking on Wikipedia for that. It also takes you to an area on the 10 Commandments in the Catholic Church, because of course the Catechism is the moral section, isn't it, is based very much around the 10 Commandments. How are we doing for time? We've got 5 minutes. Is there any other different sort of question? I am sorry that I've confused you over these divine names, but there's something very, very rich and wonderful being revealed. And I think tonight we can look at, there are many, many ways, and we can look at what I am who I am means. I think the things, so many of us, I mean, Helen's added, there's so many of us have talked about different ways of looking at all of them. I think are extremely rich, say something wonderful about who God is in our understanding. And then just on the other great teaching tonight, the Shema, Hear, O Israel. Just remember that in Judaism is the great command. And I think that, we have love the Lord your God, taken from, of course, the Hebrew Bible, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. But just listen to the Lord your God. And that may be a way into the ecology as well, if we're listening to God and God is asking us to care for the earth. Yeah. Okay, so is there any other different sort of area we want to cover? It's less, last week was very complicated.
I'm a little bit interested in the structure you drew of the Old Testament, and you did the same thing for Genesis, you notice, with the creation. And do you think this is a general principle in the Hebrew Bible
It didn't quite work, my structure, because there's, in the wilderness, there's only a few chapters going to Sinai, but there's many chapters coming away from Sinai in Numbers. But by and large, it's very interesting how it is shaped in terms of placings, that the focus is very much not only on Sinai, but what happens at the tent of meeting. And what I didn't point out to you is that it says at the end of Exodus, Moses completed the work. And if you're reading your Hebrew Bible and know Hebrew well, you'll have heard those words before. They occur almost exactly the same in Genesis chapter 2, at the beginning of chapter 2, where it says, God completed his work. So, and that happens a lot in chapter 40 of Exodus, that Moses, in the construction of the tabernacle, is echoing the steps God makes in creating the earth. Yeah. So there is, if you like, the creation of the tabernacle, the dwelling place, which of course has the Holy of Holies at the center, is also a microcosm of God's creation. And that's something that many people, both Jews and Christians, have explored, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, rich temple theology, which is very important for us as Christians as well. I know that we would say, going with the author of the book, Letter to the Hebrews, that all that sort of thing has been transformed by Jesus, and indeed it has. But I think we need to know what the book of Leviticus, or what temple theology, Leviticus theology is all about, for us to see what is happening with the author to Hebrews is saying, is Jesus is doing as well. It's very interesting. Something else I was going to say on that. I'm a bit tired tonight. I can't think. I keep losing my train of thought. Sorry. But I think that is a very rich way for us to look at things, and particularly the stress in those chapters, Leviticus, on worship. Again, our worship would be very different, but there are things we can learn from what that worship is actually saying. And, traditionally Protestants would argue that Catholics have gone back to some Jewish ways of doing things, with priesthood and sanctuaries and tabernacles, all sorts of things. And that's very interesting as well. So, are there any more questions, Greg, or anybody else?
I don't think we've got any more questions, unless I've missed them. We had a few more comments on the previous discussion, but I think that would be taking us back a little bit. So I mean, would unless anybody has anything else, we could end with a prayer, perhaps, Father Tim, briefly.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just.
It's come on to us, and it shouldn't be.
I hope you've enjoyed this evening and got something from it. But that's the main thing, really. Just to reflect on these texts. We've been through an enormous amount tonight. Last week we didn't have enough time to look at 3 chapters of Genesis, so we didn't look at everything. And this week we've been doing the rest of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So we've certainly not been able to deal with everything. And I've been learning things today myself as I've been preparing for this. But I hope you're engaged. That's the main thing. I hope from this we can there can be a group of us who might want to take things forward and getting together regularly to look at more specific, more detail of texts of the Old Testament, just to see what we can find there. All the questions and all those questions that I didn't really address last week. I set up a Babylonian story, but we could set up also another story by the side of our Genesis, the story that Richard Dawkins tells, or the story a cosmologist tells. I think there's all sorts of wonderful things to explore in terms of science and Genesis, which we barely touched on last week. I'm not an expert on that by any means, but I'm sure there are experts out there, and we can at least begin to perhaps try and get each one of us gain a way of, in our own minds, a way of which makes sense to us of what is going on in Genesis and what is being told to us about in cosmology and in evolution and so on. Excellent. So more things to think about. I hope I haven't lost you too much on the Hebrew. I didn't do it too well. I'm sorry about that, but I hope some of it was clear. And as I say, I think a lot of it is to do with God showing that He wanting to enter into relationship with us now and always, and that's why we give glory to Him. So let's finish by giving glory to God. As the glory of the Lord comes to dwell upon the dwelling place, the end of Exodus, we give glory back to God as we say together, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Hope to see.
Thank you very much, Father Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed that.
Yeah.
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 It's lovely seeing people's faces.
It is, yeah.
Oh, there was.
Anyway, I'll go now.
Oh, there's
Peter Maloney.
Peter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter.
Oh,